We're very happy to have all of you here, but we're also happy to have C-SPAN live with us today. So I want to say a special welcome to our C-SPAN crew. Always does a great job, and I just wish we could, as all of you prepare your questions and comments, I wish we had a way to take some of those from TV land. Peter Bergen has just called. He has landed at National Airport, and I think he's about 3 minutes away, so he will probably slip in right next to us here. I'm going to introduce Peter and Anatol right now, and Peter is going to basically take over the Q&A period for this. What we're talking about today is Pakistan on the Edge. Peter Bergen, who is a senior fellow here at the New America Foundation in our American Strategy Program, as well as Anatol Lieven, who's a senior research fellow here at New America, have both recently returned from Pakistan, having met with leading figures from the government, the military, the opposition, the radical Islamist groups, and the administration of the Northwest Frontier Province and tribal areas. And of course, we have an election just around the corner. Lots of potential convulsions being considered in an arena, part of the world that has huge impact on American national interests in many different ways. Let me tell you a little bit about Peter Bergen, who is on his way. Peter, of course, is Schwartz Senior Fellow here at New America and an adjunct professor at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's also a research fellow at the New York University Center on Law and Security, an institution we work with very frequently. He is up here on our wall. You can see we have book covers of various books New America has written. Peter has two of them up there, Holy War, Inc., about his own chronicle of Osama bin Laden and the very corporatist nature of al-Qaeda as he read it at that time. And then, of course, he wrote the popular book recently as The Osama bin Laden I Know, an oral history of al-Qaeda's leader. And this was basically a tale of bin Laden by people that, of course, Peter knew him and interviewed him at a time when the CIA was having a tough time finding Osama bin Laden. But this is essentially other people who grew up with or knew bin Laden. Peter is also CNN's terrorism analyst and will be a very thoughtful person to listen to about this subject on Pakistan. Anatol Lieven, a very great personal friend of mine, is now chair of international relations and terrorism studies at King's College London. I think that's the first time this has been announced. Is that right? And he is, of course, senior research fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. Anatol Lieven's latest book, Ethical Realism, A Vision for America's Role in the World, which he co-authored with John Hulsman, has been one of the big books this last year. There are a couple. Michael Lynn's book on the American Way of Strategy. I would say Samantha Power and Peter Beinart's book, we debate these internally, are some of the most important books written on foreign policy, grand strategy, and thinking out there. I tend to be in the Mike Lind, Anatol Lieven camp more than the Peter Beinart camp, but I like to recognize all those people who are essentially contributing to the public debate. Anatol spent most of his career as a British journalist in South Asia and the former Soviet Union. He's the author of several books on the latter region as well, and he's just an outstanding commentator. I would encourage those folks who, particularly Wolfgang Portzig and the other gentlemen, come right on up and join us here, and encourage the staff to work hard to get chairs for anyone else. There's some room up here, and just avoid the C-SPAN cameras. But without further ado, please help me welcome Anatol Lieven, and Peter Bergen will be with us shortly. Anatol.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for coming. I hope Peter does turn up soon, because otherwise I'll have to debate with myself, since our views differ quite considerably. I should perhaps say that the title Pakistan on the Edge is my title. At least it comes from an article that I wrote on the basis of an interview that Peter and I did together in Islamabad in May with an Islamist leader. And on the strength of that, I wrote an article for the online journal Open Democracy. But of course, it wasn't actually my title, it was Open Democracy's title. And it doesn't really reflect my feelings, at least when it comes to the slightly melodramatic air that we often get with articles discussing Pakistan. As I shall try to bring out in this talk, I think that Pakistan actually enjoys a great deal more underlying stability than news reports, headlines would suggest. And I'll try and explain why this is so. One thing that I would like to say very strongly, though, which I have also said in several articles in recent years, is that I think it ought to be fairly obvious that in that part of the world, when it comes to our long-term vital interests, and especially, of course, our interests in the so-called war on terror, Pakistan is our greatest priority. Pakistan is the most important country, not Afghanistan. That should, I think, be fairly obvious if one looks simply at the obvious facts. Pakistan has more than 6 times the population of Afghanistan. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has a very large diaspora, especially, of course, in my country, Britain, which, as we've seen, alas, in the past, we don't yet know whether that was the case in this latest incident in England, but the Pakistani diaspora in Britain and its connections and family in Pakistan have acted as one of the greatest terrorist threats now to the West in general. Not just Britain, but the West in general, because, of course, Britain is part of the European Union. British citizens, therefore, enjoy free travel in the West. It is conceivable, I hope this won't be necessary, but it is conceivable. And here's Peter. So I won't have to debate with myself after all. Steve introduced you already and then it skipped out. As I was saying, we may well disagree mildly with each other on certain points. It is conceivable, though I hope it won't be necessary, that in future we may have to accept the defeat, at least, of our larger scale plans for Afghanistan and go back to some kind of containment. It is almost inconceivable to see how we could contain Pakistan in that sense, or how we could accept the collapse of the Pakistani state without basically accepting defeat in the war on terror as a whole and pulling back from the Muslim world as a whole. Now, there is a conscious or unconscious assumption here among, I think, most people that by fighting the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan, we are also helping to fight against Islamist extremism and terrorism in Pakistan. For me, that is only very partially true. It is true that as a result of 9/11 and the greatly increased American and international pressure on Pakistan that resulted, one very beneficial result has come about, and that is that Pakistan has greatly reduced its support for terrorism against India and for wider militancy and insurgency in Kashmir. Unfortunately, however, it's also true that our presence in Afghanistan has, on the other hand, fueled Islamist militancy in Pakistan, especially in the Pashtun nationality, which forms the overwhelming majority of Taliban support. Now, how we square this circle of, on the one hand, obviously having to do our best to try to prevail in Afghanistan without bringing such pressure to bear on Pakistan and so radicalizing important parts of the Pakistani population that we really undermine Pakistan's stability, I don't know, frankly. Obviously, we have to do our best to win in Afghanistan, above all, I would say, by trying to develop that society economically. But one thing I would like to say very strongly, and that is that if, at any stage, we were to decide that it was worth really sacrificing the stability of Pakistan for the sake of what might be an illusory victory in Afghanistan, we would be making a lunatic's bargain. In the long run, Pakistan is the priority. Now, that said, and as I suggested in my opening remarks, Pakistan is not nearly as much on the edge as a good many media pieces, articles and reports would suggest. If you look at the history of Pakistan, at least since the West and East Pakistan broke up in the Bangladesh War, now I know this sounds counterintuitive, but you could say that one of the striking things about West Pakistan, what is now Pakistan, has been its stability. under the surface volatility of military coups, repeated falls of government, dissolutions of parliament, and a good deal of violence on the ground, it has been remarkable how the same classes, the same cadres of people, the same institutions have kept coming back and dominating the situation. Remember, this is South Asia. This is not Western Europe or North America. And if you look at the comparison between Pakistan and other countries in South Asia, well, it's a pretty melancholy comparison, of course, if you look at the situation in Sri Lanka, in Burma, even in parts of India, in Nepal in recent years. But Pakistan, I would say, is somewhere in the middle. It's even in the middle as far as India is concerned. Pakistan is obviously, taken as a whole, not nearly as successful as the really dynamic parts of India, Bangalore, around Delhi and so forth. On the other hand, actually, Pakistan as a whole isn't nearly as bad as the situation in Bihar, for example, and certain other parts of India. There is a lot more violence and disorder in India than we usually hear about in the media in the West. So Pakistan is not, in fact, in imminent, or even I would say in the short to medium term, danger of collapsing as a state. It is held together, I would say, by two things. One is this immensely intricate net of political clans. They're sometimes called feudals, but this is very inaccurate. But landowning clans, clans of urban bosses, networks of property owners, who basically dominate by far the greater part of Pakistani society. And these people are, by their very nature, not revolutionaries. And although they have tremendous and bitter divisions among themselves, often, or perhaps even usually, not between families but within the same family, there is also a general rule that they do not proceed to ultimate extremes. There are quite a lot of murders in Pakistan. There are very few executions, at least at that level of politics. The second institution which holds the country together is, of course, the army. Now, both of these factors in Pakistan have positive and negative aspects. The positive aspect is, as I say, stability. The country sticks together. The great majority of political groups do not go to extremes in trying to push for secession, for outright rebellion or revolution. And the ultimate guarantor of that is also the army. On the other hand, of course, the army has certainly acted as a factor in, not I think the original factor, in stultifying and preventing the growth of democracy in Pakistan, because that comes from much older cultural, social and economic factors closely linked to the rule of these clans that I've described. But certainly the army has acted as a factor in hindering the growth of democratic consciousness and practice. And the network of clans and bosses that I've described, while it has made for stability, has also been very bad for radical social and economic change in Pakistan. At the moment, when it comes to political stability in Pakistan, there are two forces working against the Musharraf administration. The first is the large-scale mass movement or semi-mass movement which has been galvanized by Musharraf's attempt to get rid of the Chief Justice of Pakistan in order to strengthen his chances of remaining president, and it seems he still hopes Chief of the Armed Forces after the elections this year. And this has led to a considerable mobilization of people on the streets in support of a broad coalition, I mean a very tenuous and fragile coalition of opposition forces, such as we've seen, again and again and again in Pakistani history, going all the way back to the 1950s. What, in my view, this reflects above all is three things. One is a genuine desire for a restoration of democracy. A belief in democracy is deeply rooted, at least in the educated classes in Pakistan, however poor the practice may be. The second is a thoroughly 18th century phenomenon related to the structure of Pakistani politics as I've described it, which is that sooner or later this happens to every Pakistani government, civilian or military. The reason is that when it comes in, it makes a lot of promises. It promises jobs, it promises contracts to these politicians and their political clans. And of course, Pakistan being a pretty poor country, it simply can't satisfy all these demands and all these promises. And sooner or later, therefore, you get a coalition of more and more and more disappointed people. Disappointed not necessarily just because they haven't got something, but because somebody else who is their rival in their own district has got more, which, given the way that the politics is structured, almost forces certain political clans into opposition. They then can call upon, this coalition of the outs, if you will, can call upon the other perennially dissatisfied force in Pakistani society, which is simply very large numbers of unemployed and semi-employed young men, perennially dissatisfied with the state of the economy and their own lives. Now this does not add up to a revolutionary movement. As I say, we've seen this again and again and again in Pakistani history. It doesn't change the basic structures of the state, and it won't, even if Musharraf falls. There is one revolutionary force in Pakistani society, or rather it's many different groups within a sort of loose umbrella, and that is, of course, the radical Islamists. Now, even they are not as revolutionary as their ideology and rhetoric would suggest. Most of them have repeatedly done deals with different forces over the years, and indeed, when I asked one of the leaders of the Jamaat Islami whether after the next elections he could imagine his party making some sort of a deal with Benazir Bhutto's PPP, he shrugged his shoulders and said, sure, why not? We've done it many times in the past, which is entirely true. Nonetheless, these are a force with an ideology which wishes to replace the existing state. They're not going to be able to for a long, long time to come, thank God. They simply don't have the mass support. Even at the most radicalised moment, at the last Pakistani elections, they didn't get more than 15%. The general assumption is that their vote will drop. They don't stand a chance of taking over the state. In any case, the army wouldn't let them. What, of course, they can do is cause a lot of violent disorder. And inside Pakistan, we have seen a very considerable growth, both in suicide bombings aimed at members of the existing administration and members of other political parties, and perhaps even more worrying, attempts, even in Islamabad itself, to create local Islamist vigilante groups which are essentially trying to take over and regulate local society. And one sees that above all, of course, among the Pashtuns in the Northwest Frontier province. Now, when it comes to the events of the next few months, like I believe much of the present US administration, and it's a pleasure, a very unusual pleasure for once to agree with what I believe to be the Bush administration line. It doesn't happen to me very often. The hope appears to be that some kind of deal can be struck between President Musharraf and Benazir Bhutto, which would allow Musharraf to stay on as president, step down as chief of the army staff, and Bhutto, or more likely one of her party, would come in as prime minister. This would have to involve, of course, not a PPP government, because according to the latest polls, the PPP doesn't have more than 25% of the vote. It's the biggest party, but it by no means has a majority. It would have to involve a coalition between the PPP and other parties. This would, in my view, be the best option. It would reduce what otherwise is likely to be a long period of political instability. And that would, above all, be good for the economy. And in the end, it is, after all, the growth or stagnation of the economy which is critical to the future of Pakistan. The economy, by the way, I should say, has been well managed in recent years by Musharraf and his Prime Minister, Shaukat Aziz. I hope that the economy would go on being well managed under a civilian government. Now, the problem is, I mean, there are two problems with the possibilities of this deal. One is that obviously there is an enormous amount of hostility between Musharraf and Bhutto. And it's even been suggested to me that Musharraf would find accepting Bhutto herself, at least, as Prime Minister, so humiliating that he would prefer to step down. The other side of this is that Musharraf's prestige has declined so greatly as a result of the events of recent months that a good many people in the PPP now don't believe that they have to make a deal. They believe that he will be forced out sooner or later. And then the army will have to allow them to come back to power. And I think myself that if in fact a deal isn't struck and the present setup continues, at some point, and it could be years away, it doesn't necessarily have to be within the next months or even the next year, Musharraf probably will be asked to step down by the high command of the army. Once again, this is something that happened before, especially the most notable case was with Ayub Khan in the late 1960s. At a certain point, when the army decides that instability is getting too great, it begins to face the possibility of soldiers having to keep order on the streets and open fire on crowds, not just in Karachi or in Peshawar or Quetta, where frankly they've done it many times, but even in northern Punjab, from where the army itself is recruited. At that point, the military starts to get very nervous, and it begins to think that a change of administration is necessary. And I think that since Musharraf is a very loyal army man, if he were asked to do that, he would step down. This would not mark a revolution, it would mark a shift of a kind, once again, which we've seen quite a number of times in Pakistan in the past. The critical issue, as I say, for me, is how well the succeeding administration would manage the economy. The record of civilian administrations in Pakistan in the past has, of course, been absolutely terrible in that regard, but we can hope that they've learnt from their mistakes. Let's be clear, however, before we get too carried away with enthusiasm for such a shift, what this would not be. In the first place, it would not be a return to democracy as we understand it. It would be a return to civilian rule by the same old elites, operating in the same old ways. Pakistani politics are representative to a degree, but what they represent is local structures which are in themselves not democratic at all, really. Secondly, it would only partly be a return to civilian rule. As Daniel Markey pointed out in a very good piece in Foreign Affairs, the last issue, the army would go on running an enormous part of the state behind the scenes, whether or not the Prime Minister and the leading ministers were civilians. And this is above all true, of course, when it comes to security issues. That leads me to my third point, which is that it would not, in my view, much talk here to the contrary, lead to a positive transformation, from our point of view, of Pakistan's policies in the war on terror, and it wouldn't lead to a massive crackdown, most notably, on the Taliban in the tribal areas of Pakistan along the Afghan border. The reasons for this are twofold. One is, as I've said, that it would be the army that would have to do that. And no civilian government will be strong enough. I mean, least of all, a civilian government headed by a party with only 25% of the vote, to order the Pakistani army to do something that it really doesn't want to do. In other words, as long as the attitudes of the army remain as they are now, that isn't going to happen. Secondly, it isn't going to happen, in my view, simply because of the level of resistance to this in the Pashtun areas of the country, including, be it said, in the Pashtun sections of the army. I mean, you hear this line that a democratic government of Pakistan would have the legitimacy and the mass support, really, to crack down on Islamist extremism in Pakistan. Now, that may be true when it comes to instances of extremism outside the Pashtun areas, like the Red Mosque in Islamabad, which we visited together, because there have been suggestions that one of the things which has been emboldening the Islamists there have been connections with the army, whether past or present. But to judge by my latest visit to Peshawar, the question of whether you have a democratic or military government, or rather I should say a civilian or military government in Islamabad, would make no difference at all to the willingness, or rather the profound unwillingness, of the Pashtuns to accept any such major crackdown. And when I talk to students at Peshawar University representing a very broad range of Pashtun opinion, including several supporters of the PPP, I asked them this question. Every single one of them, I can't remember if it was 23 or 24, said absolutely not. We wouldn't accept this, and we think that, Pashtuns will be right to fight against it. And I said, but why? If it's a democratically elected government, doesn't it have the right to do that? And they basically said, look, you know as well as we do that a government which did this wouldn't be responding to the democratic will of the Pakistani people, it would be responding to orders from Washington. What's democratic about that? So, in my view, to sum up, first, the long-term stability and success of Pakistan is our most important priority in this region. Two, in the short to medium term, this stability is not as threatened as reporting here would have suggested, and is not likely to be radically undermined or shattered by either, let us hope, a peaceful transition to some new mixture of government in Pakistan, or even the fall of the Musharraf administration. But the third point is that if in the longer run, well, not in the very long run, because then other factors begin to kick in the medium run, over the next 5 to 10 years, if there is a truly grave threat to the stability of Pakistan, and even its existence in its present form, that threat comes from a mixture, of course, of Islamist radicalism with our own actions. There is only one person in the world, in my view, who can actually make a decision that would shatter Pakistan as a state. And he's not sitting in Islamabad, and he's not sitting in a cave on the Afghan border. He's sitting in the White House. I hope you will not make that decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. So I'm just going to talk briefly some things that are complementary, I think, to some of the things that Anatol said. Somebody's rather cleverly said that the real twin towers are Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and it must be painfully obvious why that is the case. Pakistan will be the 5th largest country in the world that has nuclear weapons, and there's a sort of central tension in Stephen Cohen's idea of the idea of Pakistan. I think had a very clever idea that the central tension in Pakistani life is it a country for Muslims or is it a ideologically Islamic state? And that tension, I think, is a question that has never been fully resolved. Now, Islamabad is probably one of the most boring cities in the world. It's sort of like a tropical version of Canberra. The neighborhoods have names like F6 and E11. Nothing interesting ever happens there. So it is quite surprising when 3 things simultaneously interesting are happening in Islamabad. And let me tell you what they are. First of all is the drama surrounding the Red Mosque, as if Jerry Falwell and David Koresh had gotten together and opened an institution a few blocks from the White House, surrounded by thousands of their followers, some of them armed. The second is the constitutional showdown between the Supreme Court Justice and General Musharraf. And the third, of course, is the impending election. So a brief word about the Red Mosque. Anatol and I went there and we talked to the Abdul Rashid Ghazi, who runs the place, and he had a number of interesting things to say in very good English. One is he said females should be educated, which obviously puts him at odds with the Taliban fundamentalists across the border.
But simply because his female students should be educated doesn't mean that he doesn't have fairly radical views. And as you know, groups of his students, amongst many other things they've done, they've closed video stores, they've burned CDs, they've kidnapped, most recently, a group of Chinese masseuses. They're either masseuses or they're prostitutes or they're working in a clinic. It's not very clear. But since China is Pakistan's closest ally, this provoked quite a major problem, and Ghazi had to sort of stand down and let these Chinese women go. But the broader point here is when you've got what some have called the Talibanization of Islamabad, or what we could call girls gone jihadi, in the capital. This is a new development, and the fact that the government is sort of unwilling or unable to really do anything about it. As you may know, the group of students seized a municipal library adjoining the Red Mosque, and they've basically been holed up there since. And I think it is indicative of a creeping Talibanization of Pakistani life. I mean, there is this paradox, as Anatol correctly pointed out, when the Islamist parties have had an election, when they've been in elections, they've done pretty poorly. The 2002 election, which Musharraf fixed so that the secular parties would do rather badly, they only got 12% of the vote. And if you actually poll on the question right now, what would the Islamist parties get right now? I think the idea is that they would get 5% of the vote. So at the same time that the Islamist parties aren't particularly powerful, yet on the other hand you do have this creeping Talibanization of Pakistani life, a seeming paradox. But it certainly got the attention now of the Musharraf government, because there was a very good story, I think yesterday in the New York Times, maybe the day before, where the National Security Council had a meeting on June 4th to really begin to discuss the fact that the Talibanization had moved from the tribal regions into the settled areas of the Northwest Frontier Province, and as with these multiple suicide attacks that are happening, clearly this is a concern to the Pakistani state. So that's crisis number one. By the way, the United States is, I hate to keep, Anatol was also praising the Bush administration, and I'll add another piece of praise, which is one of the things the U.S. government is doing about all this is asking for $750 million of U.S. aid to be funneled into the tribal areas, which I think is not a bad idea. The second crisis, of course, is the constitutional showdown between the Supreme Court justice. Now, the Supreme Court Chief Justice is not necessarily the most heroic figure in life. He's somewhat given to the pomp and ceremony of his office. He was sort of finagling favors for his son, not the first Pakistani official in recorded history to have done that. But the fact is that because of his somewhat in taking a number of independent stands on cases dear to the Pakistani government's heart, they essentially asked him to resign on the basis of the fact that he was supposedly abusing his office. And there was a wonderful scene in Musharraf's where there was a 5-hour standoff, and Musharraf was in full military uniform in this discussion as he asked the Chief Justice to resign, and showing that Musharraf does retain some sense of humor. When he was criticized later for not being dressed in civilian dress, he said, "Well, should I have been in sports kit?" So but the point of the story is that the Chief Justice case, I think, was an accident waiting to happen for Musharraf. Musharraf has an enormous ego married to a messiah complex, as is clear from anybody who's read his 2006 autobiography, In the Line of Fire. And he recounts, every high school debating certificate he got, and he relitigates feuds from 25 years ago. And he clearly believes that he is the man to save Pakistan. And he's done some good. Certainly he's shown a great deal of courage going after al-Qaeda in Pakistan. I think he's shown a great deal of courage on the Kashmir issue, which seems to be moving in a quite positive direction. And he's, as Anatol pointed out, the economy is doing quite well in Pakistan, 7% growth rate. That being said, he's made a number of blunders over the years, and the Chief Justice is not the cause of his problems, it's the occasion. Because I think if you look at the things that Musharraf have done that have been mistakes, he gradually began to alienate different constituencies. The first mistake was rigging that 2002 election so that the religious parties would do better than they'd ever done in Pakistani history. The second mistake was basically to renege on his promises to basically take off his uniform and surrender the dual role of president and chief of the military. The third mistake was a disastrous incursion into Waziristan in 2005 that not only was deeply unpopular for the army, deeply unpopular in Pakistan, it was also a military defeat for, after all, the most important as Anatol points out, the most important institution in Pakistani life. And, of course, there's just simple fatigue. Musharraf has been around for 8 years, and as we know in our own system, people want to change. And so the wave of protests that accompanied this constitutional showdown did have some aspects, I think, of the People's Power movement that brought down Marcos in the Philippines. I'm not saying they're exactly analogous, but the fact is that there were no political parties involved initially in these protests. This was, really genuinely a sort of civil society type protest. And another factor that I think has made it much stronger movement is in the days when there was just PTV, the mind-numbingly boring state television, none of this would have been covered. But another thing that Musharraf, to his credit, has done is allowed a fairly free and independent press, particularly television, to spring up. And the next mistake was Geo Television, which is the largest of the Pakistani private networks, was carrying live pictures of these protests, and essentially a group of government policemen armed, basically attacked the station, roughed up the receptionist. But all of these pictures were being covered live to the point that Musharraf actually had to apologize on Geo Television. The government continues to try and interfere with the coverage of this story, for instance, taking Geo Television's signal off the air for several days earlier in June. But I think the cat is out of the bag here, and the crowds that are asking for the independence of the judiciary and the separation of Musharraf's role as military chief and the president, I think, sort of speak for themselves. And finally, the other, of course, the main drama is the election. It seems to me that Anatol talked about the deal. I mean, the deal, and I just want to sort of repeat and maybe repeat what that deal might look like and perhaps amplify it a little bit. Musharraf and Bhutto were obviously cutting a deal. As Anatol pointed out, essentially because of the riots in Karachi in May, which killed mostly Bhutto supporters, Bhutto, and also the fact that the people in the PPP may think that Musharraf basically is so weakened that we don't need to do a deal with him. But I think a deal will be struck, and the deal that would seem to be emerging would be that Bhutto would be allowed to come back to campaign for her party. After all, she is arguably the most popular politician in Pakistan. She can't run for prime minister because she's prevented from, but constitutionally, from running. She's already run for 2 terms, and the Constitution says you can't run for 3. Although, of course, the Constitution in Pakistan can be amended. Musharraf would drop the corruption charges against her. Benazir Bhutto would then effectively choose the prime minister. Musharraf would retain the presidency either with the present parliament electing him or more likely the next one, and he would drop his uniform. And I agree with Anatol that I think this would be the best of all possible worlds in this situation. And Musharraf really faces kind of an interesting choice right now. He can basically be a sort of General Zia light and go down and basically continue down this autocratic road where he's imprisoning opposition party activists, thousands of them, cracking down on the press, resisting the calls for him to take off his uniform. Or he can position himself as the heir of Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, and create a sort of genuine power-sharing arrangements between the secular political parties and the military based on a liberal, moderate vision of Pakistan's future. And so that decision is going to happen in the next several months. There is one wild card, and just to sum up in conclusion, the wild card in all this is what, and this is not something necessarily that will happen in the next few months, but it is something that's likely to happen in the next few years or perhaps decades, and it's at least worth us considering. All this political maneuvering means nothing if there is a catastrophic terrorist attack somewhere in the United States or the United Kingdom that could be traced back to the militants in the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas. And when I say a catastrophic attack, I don't mean 20 people. I mean a mass casualty attack, something on the scale of 9/11. Such an attack would generate enormous pressure in Washington and or London for the United States and its allies to actually go into Pakistan and destroy al-Qaeda and Taliban sanctuaries there. The gloves would come off as they did after 9/11 in Afghanistan, only this time that would be happening in Pakistan itself. Quite how that would play out politically in Pakistan is anyone's guess.
Questions, please.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent
Perhaps you
Writers.
could stand up.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. So, what more would you say about Pakistan's relationship specifically with Saudi Arabia and Iran? How you see, and also, I mean, has there been any significant changes in those relationships recently?
With Saudi, relations with the Saudi state remain extremely close. The Saudis, under pressure from us a lot, but also very much at the request of the Musharraf administration, the Saudi authorities have scaled back drastically their former support for radical Islamist groups within Pakistan. Unfortunately, of course, private Saudi money continues to flow to those groups. And, well, Peter probably knows a great deal more than I do about just how effective or ineffective the Saudi state is in doing something about that. With Iran, Pakistan's relations are highly complicated. In the past, of course, during the 1990s, there was tremendous tension, leading on one occasion to the very brink of war, between the Pakistani-backed Taliban on the one hand and Iran on the other. And you may remember that several Iranian diplomats were murdered by the Taliban as part of a general massacre of Shia in one of the areas of Afghanistan. Now, I have found among Pakistani officials, at least some of the ones I talked to, a very strong belief that in the long run, Pakistan and Iran will have to sit down together with, of course, Russia, India, and yes, the US in the background, and make many of the key decisions when it comes to the future of Afghanistan. This, I believe, is also a rather strong belief in Tehran, that after all, we are the regional countries. There seems to be a rather strong belief in both places that we're not going to cross the course, that in the long run we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, and that they're going to handle the results. And it will be up to those two countries to try to keep the resulting conflict in Afghanistan within some kind of bounds. But it's a complicated relationship because on the other hand, on the third hand, or however many hands it is, of course there is great resentment in Iran at Sunni Islamist attacks on Shia in Pakistan and what they feel to be the inadequate actions of the Pakistani state in preventing that. Sorry? Oh, are they not on? Just speak up.
They seem to be. Go ahead.
Heather Malik, Woodrow Wilson Center, international student from Pakistan. I'm doing an independent research project on madrasa education reform. A lot of USA was promised and has ended up in Pakistan since 9/11. And I was wondering, while you were there and were assessing the security situation, political orientation, and where Pakistan was headed, one of the primary goals of the United States administration has been to deter the next generation of Islam. I was wondering, while you were there, if you picked up any signs, positive or negative, when it comes to education reform in the larger context of U.S. foreign policy.
I don't know. It's sort of a tough one. There's been a lot of discussion of madrasas as being a source of terrorism. Certainly madrasas are a big problem for, I think, what happens internally in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But as a source of terrorism in the West, it's really a non-issue. I looked at the 5 major anti-Western terrorist attacks where there was reasonable information about the people involved. The first Bali attack of 2002, the 9/11 attack, the London attack of July 7th of 2005, the embassy attacks of 98 in Africa, and the first Trade Center attack. Because I'd heard so often that madrasa people students were responsible, and yet in the years of reporting on Al-Qaeda, I'd never met a single Al-Qaeda member who'd been to a madrasa. And it turned out that the 79 terrorists involved in these attacks, almost none of them had gone to madrasas except in the case of Indonesia. 54% of them had attended college. Half of those who attended college in the West. That made them slightly better educated than most Americans. 52% of Americans attend college. 2 of the sample had PhDs, 2 were studying for their PhDs. If they had a speciality, if they had a college degree, the most likely college degree they had was engineering. Ramzi Youssef was an engineer from Wales who blew up the Trade Center the first time around. His uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, has studied engineering in North Carolina, who was the operational commander of 9/11. And we now just have the news today that the guy who crashed that van into Glasgow Airport is a doctor, an Iraqi doctor. So that may not exactly answer your question, but I think that the kind of the hyperventilation about madrasas as being a kind of threat to the West has been much overemphasized. And if you think about it, if you go to a madrasa, you're in some ways, you're a functional idiot. I mean, you learn to read the Quran by rote in a language you may not understand. This does not get you through JFK Airport to, attack the World Trade Center again.
I think that's a very, very important point. To some degree, we're still benefiting, long may it last, in Afghanistan, from the fact that most of our opponents are highly uneducated and not capable of serious organisation.
I don't think these are working, are they? These microphones.
Get closer.
Is this better?
No.
Well, can somebody?
Maybe I better speak.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. We'll take turns.
Sorry about this. Is this okay? What Peter said leads to something else that's very important, which is there's nothing more dangerous than, a lot of money now is going into Pakistani state education, secular education. But there's nothing more dangerous than producing graduates from such education without good jobs for them to go to. They're the most worrying people of all. In other words, if we want to fight against Islamism and extremism and future instability in Pakistan, we have to develop the Pakistani economy as a whole and not just try to put patches on particular bits of it.
Januri from Afghan TV, Voice of America. I have a question on the Afghan-Pakistan relationship. What's your assessment of relationship between developments in Pakistan and situation in Afghanistan, the unrest between all this extremism going on, and what's the practical tool for Pakistan to eliminate or at least prevent what's expanding right now in Pakistan?
Well, obviously, the Taliban does enjoy great support in the Pashtun areas of Pakistan, and especially in the tribal areas. And I don't think there can be any doubt at all that the Taliban is using them as a reserve base and is coming over the border in large numbers to launch attacks in Pakistan and to go back again. It's also true, however, clearly if you look at patterns of fighting on the ground, that there is tremendous support for the Taliban within Afghanistan, in the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan, which is due to a whole set of historical, cultural and social factors which we, the West, have failed so far to do anything about. The question, I suppose, is simply, given the rather disastrous example, which Peter alluded to, of the Pakistani state's attempt, at a really heavy crackdown in 2005, what we and the Pakistanis together can be doing more effectively. Well, what we can be doing inside Afghanistan, is a different, subject, and Peter would like to touch on that. When it comes to dealing with the Taliban within Pakistan, my view is that this is going to be a long-term process, to do with development, to do, frankly, let's be brutally honest, with killing so many of them who go into Afghanistan, as has happened so often in the past, going back, to the 19th century. The British had long experience of this. That, for a while at least, the motivation goes down. It will never go away. I mean, this is an ancient pattern of Pashtun history. But it's also an ancient pattern of Pashtun history, frankly, that if they get a bloody enough nose, then they back off for a while. One thing that I would myself, be deeply opposed to, frankly, even if, God forbid, there is a massive attack in the West, would be for the West itself to go over the border and try to clean it out, because in my view that would simply push the problem out of the tribal areas back into Peshawar. And don't forget, by some accounts, neither Peshawar nor Kabul are the greatest Pashtun cities in the world. Karachi is. So, one has so many historical examples of how that kind of intervention simply metastasizes the problem. The last thing I would say, as far as what the Afghan government can and should do is, at some point it has to recognise the Durand Line, as an international frontier. There is a deep, cognitive dissonance about Kabul on the one hand calling for Pakistan to strengthen its border with Afghanistan, when Kabul itself doesn't recognise that border.
Yeah, I want to amplify that point. I think Anatol is exactly right. The Durand Line from 1893 is what the British put between the Raj and Afghanistan, and for Afghanistan to constantly complain about cross-border incursions over a border it doesn't recognise is quite paradoxical. On the question of Pashtun, the whole sort of Pashtun question, one thing that's worth noting is that the Pashtuns are the largest tribal grouping in the world without a state. They're larger than the Kurds. It's 40 million of them, and more of them live in Pakistan than live in Afghanistan. And of course, there has been a Pashtun, they've had a desire for their own country for some period of time. I think that is unlikely to ever happen. But what I'm concerned about, looking forward 5 years from now, is one thing Al Qaeda has never done is never become a political movement, and unlike Hezbollah, it doesn't have the idea of an Al Qaeda hospital or a school is simply absurd. But if you think about what the Taliban are doing, I think they're morphing together ideologically and tactically with Al Qaeda increasingly. The other thing is that the Taliban are increasingly seen on both sides of the border as the true defender of Pashtun rights. So if you accept my idea that the Al Qaeda ideology has really morphed together with the Taliban, both tactically in terms of IDs, suicide attacks, but also view of the world, seeing themselves part of the global jihad, and if you accept the other proposition that the Taliban are increasingly seen as the defender of Pashtun rights, then you have the possibility of a more Al Qaeda-like political movement in that area. Obviously, what is the most important thing for all of us, the international community, the United States, Pakistan, Afghanistan, NATO? It is to prevent that happening. And I agree with Anatol. It's a long-term thing. Really, the strategy in Afghanistan is really very similar to what the right strategy in the tribal areas, which is this is not a military problem, although there's a military dimension. It's a political problem, and it's about bringing people in and reconstruction and turning people away from these ideas. But that is going to take a long time. One final point. If you poll on the question, what's your view of the Taliban in Afghanistan now, as the BBC and ABC did, you find out that 5% of Afghans want the Taliban back, which is not entirely surprising since they had to suffer through them. But if you poll on the question in Helmand about the Taliban, you get the answer you get is 27% favorability rating. And so, in areas where there is a fair amount of drug trafficking, the support for, and in Pashtun areas where there's drug trafficking, support for the Taliban dramatically goes up. I think one of the most counterproductive things that we are encouraging in Afghanistan is eradication of the poppy. Let's choose our targets. One of the reasons the military didn't get involved, the U.S. military didn't get involved in the drug thing, was they thought it was counterproductive. We have bigger fish to fry. We need to deal with Al Qaeda and the Taliban. We don't need to be creating more Taliban by encouraging a policy of eradication.
Here. By the way, by way of apology for our unkind remarks about madrasa education before, I should say that two Western professors, products of excellent British schools, failed to turn the microphone from off to on.
Okay, good.
Mine says on.
Oh, I see, yes. Do on.
Next question.
Could you comment on Europe's apparent appeasement? And also, when you mentioned 750 million that reportedly was spent into the tribal areas, do you know of any sort of parallel funding that's being controlled by the Europeans?
So, I'm sorry, you said Europe's apparent
Appeasement
appeasement of who?
of terrorism in this area, in this region.
Of the Taliban or?
Yes.
I know of no appeasement. And as for aid, I mean, the British have by far their biggest single aid package in the world is now directed towards Pakistan. It's a 10-year program, which is also unprecedented. Now, maybe that isn't saying very much. We should all be doing a great deal more. But then America's aid, unfortunately, is very limited compared to aid packages that it gave during the Cold War towards key allies in Asia, like South Korea, Thailand, and Taiwan. There is no, appeasement of the Taliban. I mean, there is, of course, a very serious question as to whether Europe should be doing more, or whether particular European countries should be doing more. And of course, there's the particular issue of whether whether European countries should be paying ransoms if their journalists or aid workers are kidnapped. But there's no appeasement, is there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one is NATO doing the right thing in Afghanistan, and I think the thing that can bring this whole thing apart is the civilian casualty issue. Hamid Karzai is not is a pretty mild-mannered guy, and he's had repeated press conferences now. Just over the weekend, we had up to 130 civilians killed in another sort of astonishing disaster. And I think of all the things that the Europeans need to get their act together on and also the United States, is the use of air power in Afghanistan. Because I think this is the one issue that can really, I don't know if you agree, being an Afghan, but I think this is the issue that this is an issue which I think we're losing on.
But the problem is, why do we use air power? We use air power because we don't have enough troops on the ground. And frankly, because we don't want those troops to suffer very heavy casualties. We're using air power for the same reason that the Soviets used air power in Afghanistan, with, of course, appalling results for the civilian population. But as I pointed out, actually in a piece which came out before 9/11, this isn't coincidental. This is our way of war.
I'm Martin McMahon, an international attorney here. Mr. Bush has recently remarked that he's going to appoint a special envoy to the Muslim world, I think to the Council of Islamic Governments or something. Do you think there's much of a chance that that individual, he or she, would be successful, and would you recommend somebody with a particular type of background? And what would be on their agenda if they approached you guys about Pakistan or Afghanistan?
I'm tempted to reply in one word, no, but that would be, I think, frivolous. There is one way which such an envoy, will undoubtedly be told by every Muslim organisation what America should be doing, but isn't going to happen. That is, of course, a much stronger push for peace between Israel and Palestine, and a much greater commitment to the defence of Palestinian rights. Secondly, I think it will be a tremendous help when America eventually gets out of Iraq. But thirdly, in the context of Afghanistan particularly, there is one sort of small-scale but possibly important thing which I think such an envoy, for example, the organisation of the Muslim Conference, could do. And that is that one of the things we need to do in Afghanistan, in my view, is to buy up as many Afghan clerics as we can. Do what Napoleon did to the Catholic Church. Basically, put them on the payroll. Build not just and associate that with a tremendous program of building mosques for them. Every major construction project in Afghanistan should have a mosque in the middle of it, and not only because that makes it more difficult to blow up, but also because, unfortunately, at present, it is still across much, if not most, of Afghanistan, the mullahs who provide the only educated classes that there are. I mean, it is like Catholic priests in much of peasant Europe in the past. And we have to get more of these people on side. Now, it's very difficult for us to do these things and pay these people directly. But if we could funnel money through reputable Islamic organizations, I think that would be a help. The second thing which such an envoy could do is do what the British government and the City of London are now doing, is create more international facilities for banking under the Sharia code, which would, of course, at the same time involve much greater controls of that money than presently exist in the informal banking sector.
You must have noticed a new book of Dr. Aisha on the military's involvement in Pakistan's economic affairs. What was your reading? How did the military take that kind of research? Are they willing to concede, or are they are bent upon going ahead with the practices that are mentioned in the book?
As far as I can see, they're pushing ahead. I am perhaps not quite as outraged by this as maybe I should be, simply because, unfortunately, standards of governance in Pakistan have been so low in general. I mean, and this is something, after all, which, well, for better or worse, the Chinese military does a great deal of. The Chinese military is, of course, in one way much worse, because it uses a great deal of convict labour, which the Pakistani army doesn't. These industries are, on the whole, it seems, very well run. They're not kleptocratic. This is not Nigeria. On the other hand, of course, what this does mean is that it involves the Pakistani military so deeply in the economy as a whole that, well, it raises the possibility that at some point the military will simply, refuse to leave power at all, because its economic stake is so great that it can't afford to do so. Sorry, I'm not being very connected, but I should say that there are two more arguments in favour of this. One is that it is, after all, very much what the Turkish military was doing for many years. And Turkey, after all, is supposed to be one of our great models for the Muslim world, right? The other thing is that it does keep the army happy. It keeps the lower ranks happy. It helps to provide jobs for retired soldiers. There's a good deal to be said for that, if one of our deepest fears in Pakistan is the possibility at some stage of an Islamist mutiny in the army. The final question, which I think is an open question, is whether or not it gives the army a commitment to free market economic reform in Pakistan. If the army becomes essentially a kind of private corporation, does it therefore develop an interest in economic business growth? That's an idea that has been put to me by several Pakistani businessmen in the past. And you could say that, after all, if there's one group which should be really concerned about the army doing this, it is Pakistani businessmen, because you have a competitor emerging with, the backing of the state and military, which is certainly not, warping competition in Pakistan, at least according to standard models. The curious thing is that the business community in Pakistan doesn't seem worried at all about this, partly because it thinks that it gives the military precisely a stake in the kind of economic system and legal system which Pakistani business supports. On the other hand, now, all that sounds rather positive. It is, of course, not in the slightest bit democratic.
In recent months, there have been press reports about the ongoing activities of non-governmental organizations in Pakistan, such as the Al-Aqtar and Al-Rashid trusts, despite a ban imposed on the trusts by the government of Pakistan. I wonder if you could share your insights on the activities of these two trusts and how they may be assisting in facilitating terrorism financing.
I really don't know the answer to that.
I mean, all I can say is that when you visit Pakistani mosques, and by no means just, identified radical ones, like the Red Mosque, the collection boxes for the Taliban, for the struggle in Kashmir, for the Palestinians, for a range of, Islamist causes around the world are still there. But then to stop them being there, well, what would you have to do? You'd have to put a garrison in every mosque, or at least, have a much more intensive system of policing than the Pakistani state at present is capable of. So unfortunately, yes, I mean, money is still flowing from Pakistani society, to radical causes. And the state has not done or been able to do nearly enough to stop that yet.
A comment on that. I mean, in the intelligence circles, there's a kind of common flaw, which is identified as mirror imaging, which is basically to think that everybody around the world shares your kind of way of looking at things. And since money is very important to us, therefore it must be very important to other people. But it turns out that terrorism is A, a very cheap form of warfare, and B, you can't persuade people to commit suicide because of money. Yeah. And so, if we the people who flew those 19 hijackers on 9/11 were doing it because of religious belief. And so I think if we overemphasize the financial dimension, we're really kind of missing the real story. And I'll give you some concrete examples of how cheap a form of warfare terrorism is. The London attacks of July 7th, 2005, the British government said it cost maybe £8,000, which is whatever, $16,000. The Madrid attack, which killed 191 people, cost $40,000, basically financed by low-level drug dealing. The attack on 9/11 cost $500,000, which is considerably more, a larger sum of money. But as bin Laden pointed out, it was a leveraged investment of all time. For every dollar Al-Qaeda put in, it generated $1 million of effect on the American economy. And the one really interesting thing, which I leave as a question that maybe some of you in the room can answer, is the 9/11 Commission was based on the largest criminal investigation in history, and it didn't answer a very simple question: who financed this attack? It turns I'm sure there was an attempt to try and find that Saudis had financed it in independent organizations in Saudi charities. We've heard a lot about that, but the fact is the report was silent on this issue. We don't know who financed it. So I think that we can overemphasize this financial issue when really we need to be thinking about the ideological issues associated with this.
As far as terrorism is concerned, absolutely. When it comes to what is, after all, a rather large-scale military movement like the Taliban, that, of course, does require money, and that's where drugs, amongst other things, comes in.
Yeah, and I think on the Taliban, the interesting thing there is, Anatol mentioned kidnappings. The Italian government paid something like $2 million to release a photojournalist from the Taliban about, 9 months ago. $2 million in southern Afghanistan is a huge amount of money. So between the kidnappings and the drug money, the Taliban is doing perfectly well.
Yeah, Al Milliken again. I'm wondering if either of you have any particular praise or criticism on the way Pakistan has maintained and used their nuclear power.
Well, they haven't used it, thank God. As to, the real fear worries concern command and control, of course. But as long as tension with India can be kept down, the chances of some unplanned launch or preemptive strike are very, very low. As far as the security of the weapons themselves are concerned, I can hardly believe, given their importance to the Pakistani state, that they're not adequately protected by the Pakistani army. What the weapons do, of course, is colossally raise the stakes as far as two issues are concerned. One is if a really tense relationship with India comes back. I mean, if we went back to the days of India and Pakistan being on the verge of war over Kashmir, and there, of course, the nuclear weapons themselves, it does have to be said, provide a disincentive for going back to that situation. The second question, naturally, is the collapse of the Pakistani state itself, or a really radical split in the Pakistani military. The possession of nuclear weapons, makes those vastly more catastrophic scenarios. And although, as I say, I don't think we're anywhere near that moment yet, it is one reason why I would be so deeply concerned about whatever the provocation, about the US becoming deeply involved on the ground with military action in Pakistan.
I mean, one way to look at this is to do the thought experiment where Iran was the headquarters of the Taliban and Iran was the headquarters of Al-Qaeda, and Iran had proliferated to rogue states like North Korea and Libya, and senior Iranian nuclear scientists were meeting with Osama bin Laden to talk about nuclear weapons. Well, of course, it's not Iran, it's Pakistan. So, I mean, that's simply just a statement of fact. And so, I mean, Pakistan has actually not behaved very responsibly with this nuclear program. I think that Anatol is correct. Surely they are, they're trying to secure things now. And one other comment is that Steve Cole wrote a wonderful piece in the New Yorker about the crisis of 2002, which was probably the nearest point we've come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the crisis that happened between Pakistan and India. So it was a close-run thing. However, maybe the fact that we're seeing movement on the Kashmir issue is that both sides recognize that there can't be a kind of conventional, large-scale conventional war anymore because they both have nuclear weapons. So in that sense, it may be good news.
Yes, I mean, on the proliferation score, I should say that for me, the question is, what they do now and in future. And on that, we have to keep very, very, very close eye on them. I mean, as far as the proliferation in the past is concerned, well, I'm not an expert on the AQ Khan network, but what one does know is that repeated rulers of Pakistan, military and civilian, basically said to AQ Khan, we have to have a nuclear deterrent against India in case the Indians develop one of their own. Do what you have to do. Do whatever is necessary. Get the stuff from whoever you have to and do whatever deals have to be done. Now, we can't change the past, but we have to make sure that doesn't happen again. Equally, I don't think that, we should say that, because that happened in the past, it will necessarily happen again in future. It is, however, one reason why we should be wary of simply giving carte blanche to India to develop, whatever nuclear weapons it sees fit, because Pakistan will feel compelled to compete to some degree. And then you do have the risk, once again, that Pakistani governments will say to their servants, just get this stuff by whatever means you can. But I certainly think, that as indeed it is, Pakistan has to be under very strict supervision from this point of view.
When you ask a question, can you identify yourself as well?
I'll start.
What?
My name is Dave Hancock. I'm with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And, excuse me, considering the past experience of security agencies within Pakistan of manipulating polls and taking an excessive interest in the elections that occur there, how likely do you see it that those agencies would, again, try some sort of manipulation of the upcoming election? And considering what you said before about the possible deal between Bhutto and Musharraf, and also the interests of the stability of the military, do you think that such manipulation would necessarily happen?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that to some degree the manipulation occurs. I mean, not just to some degree, to a very great extent. Not before or during the elections, it comes afterwards. That's because so many of the political figures in Pakistan, indeed one might be tempted to say a considerable majority, are not particularly attached to any given party. They can switch. And they switch according to, as I've been saying, patronage, depending what they're offered by the government. But this isn't, a product simply of military or intelligence manipulation. This is the way that politics works. This is politics in Pakistan, as it was, in the past, once upon a time in America, as it was for a very long time in Britain. You can't change that until the society itself is radically changed, which can only happen slowly through economic development. The other problem is that precisely because so much of it is to do with a mixture of personalities and patronage, a lot of people who should be working closely together are not. Now, that is often in part the work of the government of the day and the military. But if you take the last elections in the Northwest Frontier Province, for example, it's often said that the Pakistani intelligence, the ISI, was responsible for the victory of the Islamists. Well, to a degree, but what also played a tremendous part was that the two main secular parties there, Benazir Bhutto's PPP and the Awami National Party, signed an agreement to a deal that they wouldn't run against each other in particular constituencies and that they would contest the elections together, basically against Musharraf and his supporters. And the deal wouldn't stick at district level because their own local leaders wouldn't agree. They insisted on running against each other, as a result of which, of course, naturally, they lost. Now, have they learnt from that? Well, maybe, but while I was in Peshawar this time, one of the local PPP leaders was murdered, possibly by Islamists, but his own followers assumed that he was murdered by a local ANP figure as part of a family feud. And so they had a small riot and burned some vehicles and so forth. I mean, frankly, unless you can get, ideological parties in Pakistan which will really consolidate behind a program rather than personalities, well, yeah, I mean, the military will manipulate, but other people will play into their hands.
Yeah, I'm Shir Harrell from the Project on Middle East Democracy. Maybe a related question. President Bush has certainly built up a rhetorical edifice around global democracy promotion, and some writers have been saying recently that if he's serious about this, that Pakistan could be the place to push it, and that now might be the time. Do you agree? And if so, what are the ways that the U.S. could go about promoting some kind of democratic reform, and how would this play into the rest of the United States' interests in the region?
Well, if you're looking at levels of autocracy, until recently, I mean, that could change now as Musharraf comes under more pressure. But Pakistan has been one of the mildest. In fact, hasn't really been fully autocratic at all. It's been a sort of semi-autocratic, semi-representative system. Therefore, I mean, if one's talking about human rights and spreading, beginning with the worst cases, you wouldn't begin with Pakistan. Well, you'd begin with somewhere like Uzbekistan, but you then certainly, if you're talking about US allies, you'd be talking about Egypt. And, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, as we all know, that isn't going to happen, for obvious reasons. I mean, that's why, as you said, this policy is a rhetorical one, in my view, not a real one. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I believe that the Bush administration is pursuing the correct approach, which is to try to arrange a deal between the PPP and the army. A deal which would recognise the fact that, as both Peter and I have said, the army is such a strong institution in Pakistan that it will go on playing a key role, as in Turkey, in past generations, whatever happens, whether you have a civilian government or not. The last thing I would say is that I believe that the undemocratic features of Pakistani society are due, above all, overwhelmingly to society and to the economic structures of Pakistan and the cultural structures of Pakistan, which will not be changed by simply the reintroduction of civilian government in Pakistan, because they haven't been changed by repeated civilian governments over the past 60 years. That if one wants to turn Pakistan into a much more truly democratic state, one has to transform Pakistani economy and society. The way that US aid really contributed to doing in a number of East and Southeast Asian societies in the past. But that will take time, it will take patience, it will take a great deal of money in US aid, and it will take the kind of openness to Pakistani trade which the US pursued in the past with regard to South Korea, Taiwan and Thailand. Now, pursuing those things will require a great deal of political courage and determination here, because these will have to be pushed through a deeply resistant US Congress in the face of deep opposition from powerful economic lobbies in the US. Unfortunately, I have to say that talking, using this rhetoric about a restoration of democratic institutions in Pakistan requires none of these things. That's another reason why it isn't particularly valuable.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. There is one.
Just following up to that, I mean, what you're basically, it sounded like you were saying is that, you know, Pakistan needs to be a nation state before it could be a democracy, or at least, I mean, is that a possibility ever, I mean, in the future, or is that just really, we need to just sort of go with the third or fourth, fifth best?
Well, you know, I mean, I think what will happen in Pakistan is it'll muddle through at the same sort of level, which is this sort of very imperfect. You know, it is interesting that India, which hasn't had this 4-time reversion to military rule, has been quite a successful democracy, and it's also that seems to have something to do with the reason that it's doing well economically. But I agree with Anatol in the sense that, you know, one thing that Benazir Bhutto has a fair amount of amnesia about is that the Taliban basically came up on her watch, and she and her government were very instrumental in helping them along. So I think, you know, rather than necessarily talking about democratization, certainly I think the U.S. government, you know, talking about the return to civilian rule and helping the deal to make that happen, that is, I think that's in everybody's interest. This is, after all, the second largest Muslim democracy in the world. We do talk about democratization as a way of ultimately undermining radical Islamists, and I think I think that policy does make sense. You know, we're probably just going to see more of the same.
Yes, I'm afraid so. Although I do believe that if the high economic growth rates of recent years can be maintained over a generation, that one might see, in the long run, a positive transformation of Pakistan. Of course, one should remember that in the short to medium term, steep economic growth can lead to destabilization and increased radicalism in parts of society which lose out. But if one's really hoping for a quite different and much better Pakistan in the long run, that, in my view, is the path that we have to take. And in the short to medium term, once again, I mean, most unusually, I think that the US administration probably has the right mixture. It's a pity that it isn't much more heavily funded. Thank you all very much for coming.